Welcome back to the Bible in Context.
Where context is king and the original author's intent drives our interpretation.
Yep, where are we at now?
We just finished up an episode talking about the level, where is the, or what is the level of inspiration? Is it at the word level, the letter level, or is it at the more of the, how did we put it, the thought level or the
level of the message?
Yeah, the level of the message is where we landed.
Yeah,
so that was last time. This time we're moving into talking about the New Testament. And so we want to figure out where it came from. We're going to dispel some popular myths, maybe get into some of the timing of when these New Testament writers wrote the letters and the Gospels and the New Testament. So where do you want to start?
Well, yeah, first thing would be, I suppose, talking about some popular myths about how the Bible was created. So any myths or some popular ones maybe that you've heard just hanging around in our culture?
I mean, I've definitely heard the one of like Constantine kind of forced it together. Some of the councils were influential. And so what's your thoughts?
Yeah, so I mean that's kind of, I think the what you hear a lot is that Constantine and a bunch of ancient pastors with their own axe to grind and agendas got together at the Council of Nicaea in the early 4th century, and they're the ones that actually nailed down these are the books in our Bibles, and we're excluding the ones that we don't like, including the ones that we like, and it was kind of this malicious meeting where they all picked the books that accorded with what they believed true, but they excluded other books that contained good truth. That's what you hear a lot as far as those who are don't trust what we have in the typical New Testament, and think that there's value in other books. But really, there's no backing to that view of the Council of Nicaea. Constantine or the pastors that were there did not select the books. You can actually go, and if you want something really short, on Mike Heiser's channel, Fringe Pop 321, there's a really good just explanation of what goes on here at this council. And really, this whole idea of the Council of Nicaea deciding our canon, I believe was popularized especially by the Da Vinci Code, which is not a book you should read and extract any sort of textual information from. At every turn, it's a garbage book. Yeah. If you want something more, yeah, I suppose. Yeah. If you want something more in depth, I think actually, again, leaning on Mike Heiser again, he has a lecture somewhere on YouTube that's like 6 hours long that goes over the formation of the New Testament, but it's primarily about the Gnostic texts and where those fall in there. So if you want to watch 6 hours on that, it's a great lecture. Go check it out. Yeah.
Date night, Saturday night, right?
There you go. Yeah. Yeah, I'm sure Cameron and Sarah would love to sit down and watch 6 hours of information about the Gnostic texts from one of the, probably, as much as I like listening to Mike Heiser's material, he might be one of the driest people to listen to if you're not entertained by biblical academics.
Right, right.
Anyway, back to the Council of Nicaea. So basically, Constantine's orders were not to put these books in the canon. His instructions to those who were putting the New Testament together at this time were, hey, we are going to print these Bibles. We're going to, well, not print, but we're going to mass produce these Bibles for the church. 50 copies was the instructions. And so essentially, they had to send out 50 of the same Bibles, so they had to make the choice of which ones we're going to include, which ones are we going to exclude. And so what they did was they chose the books that the church already accepted, and then they also included the books that the church mostly accepted. Some of the ones on the fringe, which might be like James and Revelation, some of those books on the end. What we have in the New Testament is not something that was decided at the Council of Nicaea. Rather, that decision had already been processed through the church for a couple of centuries at this point, and they were just falling in line with what the church already saw as authoritative, and even included those books that they mostly agreed upon as authoritative, even though there may have still been some question on them. So we'll get into a little bit more later down the road about, like, what about those Gnostic texts or something like that? Why were there not more included? Are we missing out on theology? Do they exclude certain truths? But I just wanted to take a few seconds to just go ahead and say there are better resources out there to talk about the Council of Nicaea, but real quick, that's just not how the Bible was formed. That's not how the canon was decided.
So you said they included some books that were mostly accepted. Do you know who didn't accept them, or what the controversy was? Are we going to get into that?
We can go ahead and dig into that at a later point. But for now, I'll just say that those books, there was just essentially most of the churches would accept these as authoritative. There were some that were kind of that were on the fence about these books. Some who were influential had some reservations about them, though most who were influential accepted them. So just a little bit of debate, just like what we saw with the debates about Esther and Song of Songs and Ecclesiastes with the Old Testament. There were just some who raised some concerns about them.
So other than James and Revelation, were there any other ones that were hotly debated?
Yeah, so there were some books that were labeled as, again, like these acknowledged books. So if you look at, Eusebius, for instance, he has a list of the books he considers to be in the canon. He has the acknowledged books, which were 22 books of the New Testament, lacking James, 2 Peter, 2nd and 3rd John, and Jude, and often Revelation is placed in that category as well. So those books were kind of considered on the fringes by some of these early thinkers, but they were still considered as highly regarded, and a lot even considered them still acknowledged as authoritative. And so they were ultimately included in the New Testament canon that we have in the codices that were produced from the Council of Nicaea. Well, and let me mention too, then the third category was there were some books that were popular but were considered heretical pretty much by a majority of the church, and that includes the Gospel of Peter, Thomas, the Gospel of Matthias, Acts of Andrew, the Acts of John. Those are some of those again in Eusebius's list that tell us the early church knew of some books that were popular amongst some, or at least were up for consideration to be an authoritative writing, but they were deemed by the majority and those who had weighed their theology as heretical books or not authentic to their authors. So, meaning that those who claimed to author them, or those who the books are attributed to, was not truly their author. They were created by someone else at a later time who was not associated with the supposed author, and they did not contain sound biblical doctrine. But yeah, so again, just before the Council of Nicaea, the church at large had made up its mind about what books were accepted, what books were accepted but were not entirely sure about, and then which books were heretical. And this was, again, made as a process over the course of a couple hundred years before Nicaea. We do have, as we're going to see, some more reasons to have some trust in the books that were decided upon. It's not, again, just an arbitrary choice made by the church. We're just trusting the early church as though they had all the answers. Same thing with the Old Testament and the Jewish material that we discussed last time. It wasn't just because the Jews said these are good. It's not just because the early Christians said these are good. There are some criteria we want to look at that will solidify why we accept the writings that we have and don't accept ones that are outside the collection of authoritative writings that we have. So before we get to that criteria, though, I think it might be beneficial just to talk about how were these letters formed? How did the Gospels and the epistles and letters that are in the New Testament, how were they formed? How were they written? How were they transmitted after they were written? That's going to influence the way that we view these writings and the authors listed as contributing to these writings. So first thing is, when we think of writing a letter or a book, you think of someone sitting down with a pen and paper or their computer or whatever, and just they themselves writing out something, writing a book, writing a letter. But that's not how this was done in ancient times, because the writing material was a lot more scarce and the process was a lot more costly. And also there were a lot fewer people who had training as scribes, and they were effective writers, especially with their limited supplies. And so we mentioned already, like the Rembrandt picture of Paul sitting down at a desk in his prison cell and writing his letters out probably isn't accurate. It's probably something more along the lines of him dictating his thoughts, what he wants written down for these churches, and then there is someone else there who is writing this down and organizing it, probably at first writing down his initial thoughts, and then later them working together in order to form this into a coherent letter, something that has some design to it and flows better than just his initial thoughts.
Yeah, so it's more of a work of art, in a sense. They work together on.
Yeah, I mean they're a lot more crafted, and if you're going through this big process of getting this down, you probably don't just want to freehand this off real quick. And we have the luxury today of having a computer where I can go back and read this a few times and delete words. They didn't have that, so instead you do a couple of drafts.
Right, right. Well, and if you start getting into the literary design of each one of the letters, and especially, I mean, I'm studying Revelation right now, and I mean, they're literary masterpieces, and the way that they use chiastic or chiasms and how everything ties together is just amazing. And so, yeah, I think it makes sense that these are the product of, first of all, I mean, these are divinely inspired authors, but it was definitely a team that put things together.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you definitely see that, like you said, with Revelation, the Gospel, like these are works of art. And then also, as you get into the letters, they're meant to be more occasional. I don't think they're supposed to be timeless pieces of art, but Paul has definitely, and whatever team has put this together with him, they have crafted it in such a way, again, not to make it a literary masterpiece, but to give it a flow of thought that is so well organized and
Well, and
developed.
didn't they
So
do
this
that
was not,
also
yeah,
just to help? Like these were supposed to be remembered, and so they would craft them in such a
right.
way with some repetition intentionally to be able to remember things. And this is just how in the ancient world they wrote and they thought, and so it was much easier for them than it is for us today to, I think, read and comprehend and but yeah. I mean, I think it makes complete sense that they were put together with as a group of people.
Yeah, and it's clear that from all this design that went into these were not first drafts. This was
Right.
not Paul just sitting down writing this out. This was a long effort that probably took multiple drafts, had thought into them, and also it's typical to have more so of a committee of authors as well. It's just like the scribes of the Old Testament that we talked about. It's probably not just Paul and his amanuensis sitting there writing things out, his writer, his scribe sitting there writing things out, but we even see in some of Paul's letters, he has at the beginning or the end of the letter, hi, this is, Paul and Timothy and this other person, and, he lists several people. And so it's clear that, yes, Paul may be the head figure in this letter, but this letter was written kind of as a committee. They all took down their thoughts. They all put this together and approved of it, put their stamp of, hey, I contributed and approve of this message coming from myself going to this church. And so in a lot of our letters in the New Testament, Paul may be the head figure or the lead of this little committee, but these letters were authored by committee. And so the reason I want to bring that up is because the question of authorship gets brought up a lot, and especially the criteria for deciding whether or not a letter is authentic is not always rock solid criteria, especially when you realize that there may be differing styles in these letters because there may have been a different scribe putting this together. There may have been, maybe Paul's, talking about this paragraph, but then Timothy jumps in and gives some thoughts and says, "Oh yeah, that's good. Go ahead and write down what Timothy said too." If a style or a flow of thought is different between a letter or from one letter to another letter, that doesn't necessarily mean that, okay, this is no longer an authentic letter. We'll get
Right.
more into that, but
So
that's
I wonder if
important to bring up.
it's similar to like even like you're doing a podcast, right? And so what's the process that we go through? Well, you write out some notes initially, and then we talk about the notes offline, and then we start talking, and then we make mistakes, and there's some editing, and then there's a final product that's eventually posted.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. About to say, wait, we have a process, but
Well,
but yeah. There's some thought that goes into behind it. It's not just sitting down and talking. We have to craft this a little bit. This is not just a first draft discussion,
right, right.
although it may sound like it sometimes. But surprise, surprise.
We are not professionals.
Yeah. So so that's how the letters were formed initially on a broad level. We'll come back to that point a little bit as we talk about the criteria for authenticity of these letters, because that is a criteria we need to look at when considering how a letter is considered authoritative or not. And so after that, how were these letters transmitted? Well, one thing that's interesting is Christians preferred to use a codex instead of a scroll. It actually seems like Christians were the ones that really popularized the codex in the ancient world. And there are a lot of guesses as to why that is, whether it's practicality or just you can fit more in a codex than a scroll.
What do you
But
mean by
ultimately, we
codex,
don't.
first of all?
Well, what's a codex? That's a good point. A codex is the kind of books that we read today. It's got a front cover and a back cover, and you flip through it instead of having a scroll that you unroll. So modern books are codices, codexes, and a scroll's a scroll.
Gotcha.
So
Okay, totally off the topic. How do they bind codexes initially?
I don't remember.
I don't
If you go through Bruce Metzger and Bart Ehrman's Introduction to Textual Criticism, they have a whole section on how they were harvested, the papyrus and where it came from, with kind of Egyptians leading the way and putting them all together. I don't recall how they're bound. I think you looked that up, didn't you?
Well, just the initial Google search said that they use thread.
Okay. Yeah, I don't remember that. I do remember that they kind of took these like 9-inch wide pieces of papyrus and like glued the seams together to kind of make the full pages. But I don't know. Didn't recall that facet. But anyway, you can go through that book to take a look. Also, Harry Gamble in his book, I think Books and Their Ancient Readers, talks about a lot of this process of how ancient books were made, especially in Christian circles. So good resources if you just want to learn how to make a book from scratch in an ancient Greek, Roman, Egyptian context, if you so desire. But yeah, Christians were responsible for really popularizing the Codex. And along with that, it seems like the Christian copyists that were taking these texts and getting them out there, copying it for others to read, they were not often trained scribes. They were often just untrained people who could read and write. So that includes some training, but they were not formal scribes. They weren't as professional as what we see in other texts. And there's kind of a reason for that. They were copied informally for practical purposes. These weren't Hebrew Bible scrolls that were being copied meticulously so that they could be the centerpiece of the library in your local synagogue. These were practical so that people could read them, understand the message, and really just get the message out there. It seems that there was less of a concern with being formal and with having a super high degree of checks and balances and accuracy, and more with just getting the message out. So it'd be essentially like, Nate, me and you, we have the last Bible in America. And so we're going to sit down and copy it down. And we're just trying to get these out there as quickly as possible because there's, I don't know how many churches are in America, but we have no printers or computers. It's just me, you, pen and paper. And so we're probably going to be worried about speed and really trying to get these out there than we are going to be about like really making sure we cross all our T's and dot all of our I's. We might get a few words wrong here and there, but that's okay. That's not our purpose. And really, we can cross-check them later. And that's what we do because since the concern was to get the message out there, there was frequent copying and there was widespread copying. And so we have texts from all over the ancient world that we can compare and say, okay, this person, he didn't cross his T, but he did cross his T. So that's the correct way to do it. Or, these 5 texts over here got this word right whenever this one over here got the word wrong. So it's probably the word from the 5 texts and not the word from the 1 text. So we can compare that way and see that, okay, here is what the original reading probably was.
Right.
And still have
the fact that we have so many copies helps us trust that we've got a reliable source.
Right. And so that just kind of details a little bit about how did the text come into existence, and then after that, how and why were they transmitted. And again, a lot of that too you can find in Harry Gamble's work, Books and Their Ancient Readers. That's a little bit dated, but a good resource on that. Again, there's more details as well in the canon debate. And remember, all the resources for these episodes are in our transcripts. So as long as we're doing the canon series, we'll post the canon resources in the transcripts. They're also on our Facebook page, so check that out. Okay, so after these were written down and being transmitted, we got to talk a little bit about how were they collected into a collection of authoritative documents. Did, again, a council sit down and say, these are the ones that are in, these are the ones that are out? Or can we go as extreme to say that, Paul sat down and put all this stuff together and said, here's your New Testament for the rest of history? And it seems like to say that a later committee just grabbed their favorite books and made a Bible, that is not being responsible with resources. And I don't think we can go as far back as Paul and say, like, even Paul was putting together pretty much a New Testament. Because there are some scholars that will say that as well. And they have really interesting arguments. We're going to talk about them a little bit, but I think that might be a little bit overreaching. However, we do have some evidence of those who were writing a lot of letters in the ancient world having their letters explicitly collected by their followers. And we also have evidence of some authors of important letters making sure that they have multiple copies and trying to make sure that their letters are widely circulated and collected. So there is at least some precedent for Paul perhaps saying, hey, make sure these letters get collected and handed down for instruction of later generations, or at least so that maybe he didn't have later generations in mind so much, but at least other churches can read these, collect them together, and have my letters for their own instruction. So, and really we see that in a couple of places. So first of all, we have Cyprian of Carthage, which was the early 3rd century, and he encouraged the collection and distribution of his letters. We also have Ignatius. His letters were sought after by those who followed him and churches after that. They saw his letters as being beneficial for the church, and so they were actively pursuing his letters and trying to make a collection of Ignatius's letters. So we do have a precedent in the ancient world for people seeking after the writings of their leaders and compiling them into this, somewhat authoritative set of this author's works. And so the same very well may have been done for Paul at a very early stage.
Yeah, I'm curious are you going to say something about the 7-church scheme?
Yeah. Well, Paul himself, he actually may have been encouraging this just like Cyprian of Carthage. In Colossians chapter 4, verse 16, Paul instructs the Colossian church, says, "And when this letter has been read among you, have it also read in the church of the Laodiceans, and see also that you read the letter from the church in Laodicea." And so we already have this idea of Paul making sure his letters are copied and make their rounds. We don't have the letter from Laodicea either, and there may be a reason for that, which I'll mention here in just a second. But I also just want to throw out here, along with Colossians 4:16, with Paul trying to make sure that his letter is read in multiple churches, Ephesians, a lot of scholars think, was a letter that was supposed to make its way around to a lot of churches and be a general letter, not just made for a particular recipient, but for any church. So just in that, Paul may have already been aware of his letters being important and being beneficial for multiple churches, or for all the churches that he plants. Maybe he recognizes that, hey, there's wisdom for every church in what I told this church over here. It helps that they were all from a Greek context, so maybe they understood them a little bit better than we do today, but
right.
Still, I think he recognizes there was some benefit in his letters.
And don't we have some early manuscripts where the word Ephesus is just not even in there?
We do, and so it's not 100% certain, but it does seem that it may have been absent. But however, well, the grammar doesn't really make sense, and we'll talk more about this when we get to the book of Ephesians next. But the grammar doesn't make sense if you just leave out Ephesians, and so
they had to put some church name in there,
right? And so Ephesians makes the most sense based on our data. We don't know why it was removed, or maybe it was something like a blank slate for other churches. We don't really know. But we do have some copies with that title to the Ephesians lacking. And so that's part of why some scholars will say that it's a circular letter that's supposed to go to multiple churches.
Right.
And because of some of our manuscript evidence, some of what we see with Paul's writing, some think that the letters of Paul were actually collected according to a 7-church scheme. And so in order to make it look like Paul wrote to 7 particular churches. Harry Gamble advocates that in his book that we've already mentioned. Also, David Trobisch in his book, The First Edition of the New Testament, advocates that. We'll talk more about him in a minute. But it's possible. It's not exactly for certain. And there was still some debate over what letters are authoritative and what weren't later on as perhaps confusion grew. But it may be that Paul and his immediate disciples were collecting his letter, maybe even according to a certain theme.
Would the 7 churches be the same churches that we see in Revelation?
No, because we don't have, like letters to Smyrna or to Laodicea, things like that. So, or
we do have evidence that he wrote a letter to Laodicea, though.
We do, but we don't have like the full 7-church.
We don't have all
letter scheme of Revelation. They're not like tied together or anything. It'd be to different churches. So, anyway, just an interesting proposal that there may be some evidence that they were intentionally collected according to a design, not just haphazardly, even though that's kind of how the collection seems to have grown over time. As, we include the letters from John and Peter and things like that, where it's like, oh, this is an apostolic writing, and so let's put this in here. But Paul's letters may have been collected from a very early state, even according to Paul's own instructions or those of his disciples. So we'll talk more about that again in just a minute, but we don't want to push that data too far and say that, yes, Paul created the first edition of the New Testament. That has been the proposal of David Trobisch in the first edition of the New Testament, his book. And he's a really good New Testament scholar. He's actually on the team that is responsible for the editing of the Nestle Allen Greek New Testament. So he is no slouch when it comes to the Greek New Testament. But his proposal that Paul may have put together the New Testament collection almost as we have it today, from even within his life or in the first century, has not met with wide acceptance. And it seems that it relies on some interpretations of the data that are interpolations of the data.
What's that mean?
So he's taking some of the data and having to do some guesswork about what happened in the gray area, essentially.
Making some assumptions.
That would be a much better way to put it. But yeah, it's still an interesting proposal, and I think there's something to the fact that there was a very early party among the apostolic community, or the disciples of the apostolic community, who were putting these letters together, getting them circulated, and perhaps even compiling some of these for the churches. I don't know if they knew they were building a New Testament when they were doing that, but they, at the very least, may have been actively trying to put together a collection of authoritative writings from the apostolic community. The tradition of the New Testament canon may go back as far as the disciples of the apostles in the first and second century. Again, if you want to get more details on this, if you want to just get one resource, check out the Canon Debate. Also, Lee McDonald's works are fantastic on this. One collection of Paul's letters that is often pointed to is Papyrus P46, and that is from about 200 CE roughly, and it's a codex that has Romans, Hebrews, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Ephesians, Galatians, Philemon, Colossians, 1st Thessalonians, and towards the end of the codex, it seems like they're trying to compress their words. So it seems like they may have been writing in too big of letters towards the beginning, and they're compressing at the end because they want to fit more on it. And so the proposal is maybe they were trying to write, all of Paul's letters on there. Again, that's some of those assumptions that it's hard to say for sure. But it, seems like it'd be very possible. It seems like they knew they were running out of room and they didn't plan accordingly. That's one of the major sources that Trobisch will point to assert that Paul collected his letters and other books of the New Testament to make a very early canonized New Testament by the 2nd century CE. Again, his arguments haven't gotten full acceptance, but it's very interesting to see that before or at the very beginning of the 3rd century, we already have evidence of a collection of Paul's letters plus Hebrews circulating around together. And this particular text goes back to maybe the 3rd generation of disciples from the apostles. And then we also have the Gospels, and they were recognized as a 4-gospel collection very early on. Again, the Gospels and Acts, they are found together in P45 from the 3rd century. And then we also have people like Irenaeus and others who we have recorded saying that the 4 Gospels were handed down through tradition to them. So it seems that when you get to accounts of Jesus and his life and his ministry, the Gospels, essentially, the 4 Gospels that we have are the ones that were always recognized through the apostolic tradition as being authoritative over against those that come from, the Gospel of Peter, the Gospel of Thomas, things like that. It seems like there was a tradition that already had kind of canonized the 4 Gospels we have very early on in the apostolic community. Okay, so we'll stop there for now, since we've kind of talked about the very early tradition around Paul's letters and the Gospels. We're going to continue the conversation of the tradition that led to the canonization of the authoritative texts within the New Testament. But to summarize what we've been over so far, just to kind of keep this all together, because we covered a lot in this episode and kind of wondered a little bit, I think. We talked about how the New Testament was not formed by some committee later in history, but actually has its roots back closer to the apostles themselves. Their books and their letters were not formed by single authorship, but by a committee of authors, and that's going to be important for some of our conversations next week. We talked about how Christians prioritized the Codex and were really concerned with getting the message out there than with professional writing. But we have a lot of New Testament texts from the early church in a lot of different places so that we're able to discern where those mistakes are. And so we'll talk more about the text critical aspect later, but we did see a large use of the codex, which allows us to see certain collected books together since we're doing codices instead of scrolls. And again, we saw P45 and P46, where we already have some early collections of the apostolic letters and the Gospels. And we also have, again, precedent for some early writers trying to collect their writings into these little canons of their own writings. So there is precedent among those who were influential, especially in the early Christian community, who were trying to make sure their writings were passed down so that the wisdom and the tradition of Jesus found within could be preserved.
Good summary. I'm looking forward to next time when we get an opportunity just to continue this conversation on the canon and dive into some of the dating of it and go from there.